this thing came and actually orbited around over top of the missile.
Today I got to speak with an Australian investigator who, after getting in touch with Ross Coulthart, began digging through the National Archives and uncovered some staggering truths about his own grandfather and UFOs.
Atomic level secrecy, the most compartmentalized, suppressed program probably around at that point in time.
Tom Dalton-Morgan, a man with 22 confirmed kills as a fighter pilot in World War II, was then chosen to go down under and run Australia's equivalent of Area 51, known as Woomera.
Woomera was saturated with UFO sightings.
After a dogged 12-month investigation, our guest not only uncovered direct testimony from his grandfather about a UFO that he witnessed over the Woomera Test Range, but a crash retrieval that happened at the same time.
A solid craft, but made of light, 200 meters above, zigzagging around.
The first half of today's conversation is about this story, but in the second half, our guest opens up publicly for the very first time about how in the revelations of his investigation, he was shocked to find out about an abduction experience by someone much closer to home than his own grandfather.
She was paralyzed, could only move her eyes. Ultimate fear.
We then enjoyed a free-flowing conversation about what we think UFOs actually are, how they tie into consciousness.
The amount of observable light is a very small sliver of what exists in the universe. This represents a threat to how we feel about ourselves.
There will be video chapters for each talking point marked below. It was a real pleasure, and I hope you enjoy this conversation with Rhys-Dalton Morgan. This story is something that you're kind of still in the midst of uncovering now, right? You're still kind of actively digging into this?
Yeah, it's really a work. I've kind of only really scratched the surface, I believe, on whatever I've sort of uncovered, which as we kind of go through, I guess, the story, you'll see that there's obviously a lot there. But, you know, whatever this is and whatever is being sort of hidden, whether it's just by negligence from the government, you know, not keeping track of their files or records, or there is something maybe more sinister, there seems to be a huge history and connection maybe with Australia, Britain, and the United States covering the UFO topic from a military intelligence point of view. So I've already, you know, I guess spoken with a fair few people across different fields and just trying to gather as much information about anyone that knows what happened there or who might know someone that was a firsthand witness or account. And it seems that the more information I'm gathering and the more that I'm trying to kind of target specific areas for info, the more I'm uncovering there's a lot more to this story, which is fascinating.
Before we dig into that, which we will, can you give us a little bit of a background on your grandfather in terms of kind of how he came through the Air Force and some of the accolades that he had through his time there?
Yeah, of course. So as I said, he was a famous Battle of Britain World War II ace. So he kind of he joined the war just before the Dunkirk retreat. And so he was kind of, I guess, put into the 43 squadron there. And that's where he sort of made his first claims over the English Channel. From there, he obviously became a big part of the Battle of Britain when Germany launched an assault into England. And Tom was, you know, squadron leader of the 43 during their time. And that was a really, really crucial point in World War II history in the sense that if Britain were overrun, you know, it wouldn't have given the United States an opportunity to actually be able to bring their forces to the UK and use it as an island hop, in a sense, to the mainland Europe before they entered the war. So there was very fierce fighting in the Battle of Britain, and that's where my grandfather really earned his acclaim. They were severely outnumbered, the British, when they fought against the Germans there.
In your documentary, you mentioned, is it 22 confirmed kills?
That's by the end of his tenure as a RAF pilot, yeah. So the Battle of Britain, he obviously shot down a substantial number there, and then went on to become a night fighter, which was a really interesting story in itself. He was...
Is this where you were talking about planes designed with stealth and no lights, and he's flying just only with the moonlight?
Yeah. So basically, Germany, after the heavy losses during the Battle of Britain, turned to night bombing, and Tom was sent up to sort of Scotland in a place called Drem Station, and he was actually tasked, because he was an aeronautical engineer as well, to come up with, I guess, a plane, which the Hurricane was a daytime fighter. It wasn't as quick as the Spitfire, which probably a lot of people have heard of. but it was considered a better plane for battling and for fighting rather than aerial maneuverability. And they wanted to establish a night fighting capability in the Hurricane fighter. So he was tasked with that responsibility of establishing it. So they made some adjustments to the Hurricane fighter. And while they were training pilots up there, up in Drem in Scotland, he would go out at night and run these night patrols while these big German bombers were flying in from either over near Scandinavia or from France and Germany and the mainland. And they would come and obviously try and bomb at night. And it was very hard to try and track them. But thankfully, Britain did have quite a sophisticated radar system in place, more so than the Germans knew. But Tom would then go up there either individually or in small squadrons, and they would try and sniff out these German bombers. And German bombers were, well accustomed to fighting off smaller single-seat fighter pilots. So when these raids were made, it was very difficult to shoot down German bombers at night. You had to try and use your own eyes. The Hurricane fighter was, difficult in itself to handle, let alone try and track and shoot at night. And Tom ended up shooting down 7 of these big German bombers over the period of time that he was there. So that was almost considered the most for that period of time that anyone had done or known, especially individually in a Hurricane fighter. So he gained a huge reputation there in Britain as this sort of night fighter.
There's a Top Gun.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, he was, obviously a very kind of focused and experienced pilot. Really relied on his training and also just, his instincts, I think, as well. So that led to, him eventually running operations just leading up to D-Day, which was obviously, the largest maritime invasion in the history of warfare. And he, at that point in time, was with the 2nd Tactical Air Force Group, and they were kind of making their way into France, and then would, hop around to sort of, Belgium, and then eventually Netherlands and into Germany as well. And during that time, when he was actually with the 2nd Tactical Air Force Group, he was running operations. So he was an operations officer, which means he wasn't actually allowed to fly at that point. But because he had such a good reputation as a great pilot, he'd secured permission from his commanding officer to fly as a ghost pilot for the United States Air Force. They were looking for, I guess, experienced, serious pilots to do dirty work for them, or fly operations deep into German airspace and help the bombers, the American bombers in there.
I wanted to ask you about that because that's a really interesting part in your documentary. So Tom, who was a fighter pilot for the British Air Force,
Yes,
was then recruited to the United States Air Force and was flying under the alias of previous United States Air Force pilots who had perhaps passed away or something like that. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
So what is the idea behind that? Do you know what is the benefit to doing something like that?
It's a really intriguing piece of history, and we're still not quite sure as to what it all means or why it happened. Now, because a lot of the United States Air Force records didn't keep track of this, it was actually through the logbooks that we were able to trace a lot of it, his hours, what planes he flew in. But yeah, from what I could understand and what I've been able to gather is that, the United States 8th Air Force were obviously running a lot of operations into Germany. And he'd done a lot of joint operations with the Americans leading up to that, with sort of bomber operations over northern France, where he was running group operations there as well prior to the D-Day landing. And as I said, I think he just sort of secured permission because he wasn't allowed to fly at that point in time, as he was an operations officer. And he just loved to fly. Like he just lived to fly, Tom. So any chance he could get, he went in there. But because he was an operations officer, they couldn't keep it on record. So he had to fly essentially as a ghost. And the only way for him to do that was to fly, unregistered.
Under these false aliases.
So the Americans took him on board because he had a really good reputation as a night pilot and also a great fighter pilot in general. So they, brought him into the Mustangs, which were sort of what the American fighter pilots were using, the P-51 Mustangs. And he flew those in the 4th group for the 8th Air Force. and flew 70 sorties for them during that kind of time, just in early 1944 towards the end of 1944. And yeah, they basically used the aliases of US pilots to cover his kills and his flights, so he wouldn't get into trouble for it, really.
Through your research, have you been able to uncover what these aliases were, what were used at the time?
No, it's a very sensitive issue. It feels, obviously, because the pilots would have been killed in action. There would have been a lot of family history and people looking into that stuff as well. So it's murky waters. But I think at that time in battle there was a lot of chaos. And people just did what they needed to do because that was what was required, it seems.
So from there, fill in how he then and how your whole family ended up in South Australia.
Yeah, so my grandfather was group captain in Germany during the Cold War. So particularly there were two bases, Gütersloh and Wunstorf, where he was sort of running operations there just in the late or the early 1950s, 50, 51 and 52. And during that time, obviously, it was the peak of the Cold War, and he had some really mysterious movements in and around those Cold War areas. And what ended up happening is the story was that he was convicted of bigamy, which was essentially being married to multiple women at multiple times.
Right.
And that ended up bringing him back to England for a big court hearing. And bigamy was considered a serious charge back in that time because it was the Crown considered a sin against faith, and it could lead to jail time. It was basically
Wow.
it was a serious issue back then. But I think there's probably more to the story there with these different families. He had a wife in France, a wife in Germany, a wife in England, and that's what that we know of, unfortunately.
Yeah, wow.
And there may be more to that story. I don't know. I think it's as simple as maybe
It's true what they say about pilots then.
Yeah, in that case, maybe. But yeah, this court hearing went on, and then the charges were conditionally dropped out of nowhere. And if you read the newspaper articles of the time, you'll see it was a big story in the headlines there. I think the journalists love to get on a bit of hate brigade for someone that was, had some
Nothing's
sort of, I guess,
nothing's changed there.
yeah, no. And it turned out that they had dropped these charges because he was being given a logging manager job in Australia.
Yeah, you mentioned that in your documentary. It's such a random facade to be put up for a, Top Gun pilot, all over the world to then decide to just throw it in the bin and go be a logging manager.
It's bizarre. It's totally bizarre. It's nuts.
I
And
feel like they could have come up with something a little bit better.
it definitely seems lazy. I don't know. And the thing is the judge even says when you read the paper that this man's definitely going to jail. Like the judge has said, I've never seen a bigamy case like this. He's definitely going to jail. And they were all dropped conditionally. And, that's when my sort of family, my dad was, very young when he was just born before they left. But they migrated to Australia and they landed in Sydney in a boat. And basically, the story was that he was going to do this logging manager job, which he did. He went out, to near Oberon and stayed with a family there. Sir Robert Cotton was the owner of this sort of logging and milling company that shipped milling back and forth between Broken Hill and Oberon. Very interestingly as well, that Sir Robert Cotton actually ended up becoming an attaché for the United States and Australia. So a very interesting family to stay with in itself as well. But he was only there as a facade. So Tom was staying there as a cover. And meanwhile, he was communicating with what we know as the Woomera Rocket Range with a contractor called the Weapons Research Establishment. And the Weapons Research Establishment were essentially a joint British-Australian operation to, test rockets and, experimental aircraft. And Tom was communicating with them to, find out when he was actually being called down there. So they went down to South Australia, and straight away he was then shipped up to the Woomera Rocket Range to start running Britain's rocket testing program and experimental aircraft program there. And for some context, the level of secrecy that was around the Woomera rocket range at that point in time was, the equivalent of, the Oppenheimer Manhattan Project.
What year was this again? Sorry.
So he went there in 1955
Right, middle
for the
of the
Woomera rocket
50s.
range. Yeah, the middle of the 50s. But the reason it's such a sensitive time is Britain and the United States were they were squabbling because obviously there had been a German British spy in the Manhattan Project, Klaus Fuchs, which he was covered in the movie. If you watched Oppenheimer, the spy that basically broke the trust between Britain and the United States to do with atomic energy, and Klaus Fuchs, ended up giving a lot of those atomic secrets to Britain on how to build an atomic bomb and what the work that they'd done in the Manhattan Project. The United States from then on didn't want Britain to have their own atomic weapons testing program.
Wow.
They were against it. So Britain then obviously, instead of testing and running their own nuclear program in England, they decided the best possible place was Australia. Let's go, obviously do it on the convict colony, probably. There's no concerns there. But it was obviously more so to do with that Australia was really not a populated area in the center of the desert there, and but there were indigenous tribes, multiple groups there, which is terrible in itself in the history there. And Britain sort of saw that as a way of not having to run the program on their own turf. So the Australian Prime Minister at the time, Menzies, agreed, for Britain to essentially run their atomic program down here and do the tests here. And that obviously was atomic level secrecy. So the most compartmentalized, suppressed program probably around at that point in time for anything to do with Australia and Britain. And it was only later, I really discovered how deeply entrenched my grandfather was involved in that. And I didn't realize, he was involved in that as well. But Woomera was established, this rocket range, in 1947 of all years. Given obviously the UFO history and how significant that was with Roswell and so many other incidents as well.
And we also now know that so much of this UFO secrecy is actually tied up in the nuclear act, and rather than being locked away in sort of some Department of Defense, it's actually tied in very closely to atomic energy.
Yeah, it seems to be from some of the documents and rumblings that we're hearing out of the United States that the UFO secrecy was hidden under the Atomic Energy Act, I think, of 1954. So the claim is that maybe because UFOs emitted some forms of radiation, they were then able to be classified under atomic protocols and secrecy. And they say, that's sort of what the claims have been. Yeah, that that's how they were able to disguise it and hide it. And it wouldn't then fall under the government's jurisdiction. It would be under the Atomic Energy Commission, and plus anyone who had access to that. And yeah, that a lot of people don't know this, but Australia conducted multiple atomic tests in Australia. So the Montebello Islands off the northwest coast of Western Australia, and then also Woomera prohibited area, which was Maralinga and Emu Fields in particular. And some of those were terrible tests, but they were just as significant as the Trinity test that happened in Oppenheimer.
The first time I heard about Woomera, I had no idea, despite all my sort of research in this area, I'd never heard of Woomera until about 2014 or 2015. And I was working with someone who was the last person you would expect to be interested in the UFO topic. Just a grumpy old bastard. And we somehow got onto the topic, though. I think I probably brought it up. And he just kind of turned around and said to me that I reckon it was maybe about the 80s or maybe even earlier than that. It was a bit of an older guy. And he said that he was doing work out at Woomera and that he looked up in the sky and he saw some lights there that he described as they were dancing with each other. And this is the last bloke you would ever expect to be interested or even believe in UFOs. So to hear that come from him was very interesting. And that was the first time I'd learned about Woomera, which kind of then sent me to learn a little bit more about UFO sightings and how that it's, aside from being a nuclear weapons testing range and whatever else is going on there, it's also a massive hotspot for seeing things in the sky.
Yeah, well, I think once we kind of get into the detail of some of the accounts at Woomera, while we have all these, we have a lot of documentation that shows us what was going on at Woomera, from the types of tests they were running, from these atomic tests, to experimental rockets, missiles. Like Woomera even helped with the moon landing, incredibly, Mercury and Gemini. And during all this time, Woomera was saturated with UFO sightings. And you can actually go and look through all the Australian old documents from particularly weapons research establishment, and a lot of kind of, I guess, communication between them and the Department of Supply and different areas that were involved in the Woomera prohibited area. But so many accounts from really credible witnesses. And one of those obviously happened to be my grandfather, who was running, an atomic missile test there at Woomera when he had his own sighting, when they were launching something called the Black Knight rocket, which was this meant to be almost like an intercontinental ballistic nuclear missile. And, they were setting up to launch this missile. And there was, sort of 7 or 8 people in the control tower with him, and it was just outside the launch pad. They had a recovery team a few hundred miles downwind to where the rocket was supposed to re-enter and land. And with these rockets, what a lot of people probably don't realize is they're not actually armed as nuclear missiles, but they use particular components of a nuclear missile to test the systems. So they shoot them high up into the atmosphere, they re-enter, but it might use, say, the fusing system for a nuclear bomb or the warhead, and they gauge readings.
So the missile essentially fires how a nuclear missile would, but it's just not armed with that kind of
with
weaponry.
with the atomic bomb. It's
Right.
it's like a dummy warhead, really.
And this is what they were testing at the time that your grandfather had his own UFO sighting at Woomera.
Yeah, the Black Knight, it's this massive rocket. If you actually go and look at footage of it, it's absolutely enormous. They've got footage of it in itself. And they were about to launch, and he had a call over the telecom come over from someone called Commander Percy Hawkins, who was downwind at the recovery site, Lieutenant Commander Percy Hawkins. And he said, hey, there's a bright light, and it looks like it could be an object, and it's moving at high speed towards where the control tower is, where the rocket is, where you guys are stationed. So Tom obviously stepped out of the control tower with the team there that was stationed there at the launch site. And sure enough, they picked up this bright light moving at high speed really quickly. And now Tom described it as, to another Woomera engineer there, at moving it close to probably his estimate of Mach 2. And keep in mind, this is...
What year was this?
So this is 1959.
Right.
Yeah, so just before the start of the 60s. So,
Mach 2.
Mach 2 for 1959 was like astounding, especially given, that they were only just, I think, breaking Mach 1, weren't they, around those times? It was only like, I don't even think they were. Like, that would have been very special secret programs for test flights, and it would only be direct flights if they were even getting anything close. But
yeah, I mean, the SR-71 Blackbird wasn't even in use at that point, so this is still very
it's early days.
It's very early days.
Yeah, it would have been an astounding speed, and given Tom's history being probably one of the most esteemed and respected fighter pilots there, who was also known as a night fighter. So this is happening at night, this event. This thing came and actually orbited around over top of the missile.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I'm not sure if you mentioned that in your documentary, or perhaps I missed it. So in this sighting, it wasn't just a flyover. It was kind of intelligently and curiously interested in this missile specifically.
Yeah, so they described it at about 5,000 feet, which might not, seem that close, but, in somewhere like Woomera where it's just, 3/4 sky at night, and there's an extremely bright light, very large, from the description that they're giving, this thing circling around on top of the nuclear missile above it, and then watching it there for, a good probably few minutes, this whole event. And then it in turn then just pings off, into the sky on an angle and just disappears, basically, in a sense, from the descriptions, from what it sounds like, it's almost instantaneous acceleration. And Tom, who was actually on the tower viewing this UFO, this bright light that was orbiting around the missile, he said that it appeared to be a circular craft and that it looked like it had a cabin on top from what
Yes,
he
you
could
said
see.
that in your
Yeah,
documentary. So, and I wanted to clarify that as well for the audience, that this wasn't like an orb sighting. Well, it doesn't sound like it. This actually sounds like it was a physical nuts and bolts craft, a proper UFO.
definitely. Yeah, he described it as the light actually, brought out the shape of the circular craft. And he genuinely says he, could see a cabin. And this account was corroborated by 6 other people in the control tower that witnessed the same thing. And he wrote a report on it and then submitted the report to the defense research establishments who he was sort of working for at the time, RAAF bases around there as well. And this was a really, really prominent and credible sighting with multiple witnesses, from the ones who had seen it down sight originally to the people that had been on the launch pad. So you had corroborating witnesses across different areas that had seen this object. And interestingly enough, the radar didn't pick this object up. So there wasn't a hit on the radar with this, which was quite peculiar. But as I said, it was probably still early days with that particular radar compared to what we've got now.
One thing I wanted to ask you, just going back to what we were talking about earlier. So through your research, you obviously, especially when we're talking about Woomera, you were having a little bit of a hard time kind of digging up and finding some of this stuff. So how did you come across this testimony about Tom Dalton's written testimony of this specific sighting?
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. So when the Defense Department essentially rejected me and what I was after, I went searching for information about Tom on my own, and I came across this online. It was a kind of documented account by an Australian scientist and researcher called Bill Chalker, who'd actually covered this UFO account of my grandfather's from 1958 and 1959. And it was written in there in a book that he'd written called The Oz Files, but he also did a piece on his article called Sub Rosa. And I saw that, had to sort of shuffle around to try and find some details for Bill, because I was just astounded that I'd only heard, rumors about my grandfather. There was never anything concrete. Like my own family were UFO skeptics, right? So my dad's father was Tom, but he himself had never mentioned anything about UFOs ever, and didn't even, think that they were a real thing if it was across his radar at all. No pun intended.
So there was no UFO alien interest in your household growing up as a child?
Zero. My dad was a hard ass Aussie skeptic, and his father had been, obviously, as we've come to learn, deeply entrenched in this topic. But
And how did you become interested? Was it through this, or was there a prior interest there for you?
well, and this is what I think will probably be the mind blowing revelation for people that witness this, is that I myself had been fascinated in this topic. Probably, 2011 is when I started to kind of, just after high school, get really kind of interested in the idea of it. But didn't start deep diving until probably 2017, when the New York Times article got released by Ralph Blumenthal and Leslie Keane in the New York Times, which talked about the ATIP sort of secretive UFO program that was investigating these from 2005 to 2012, I think. And from then on, I remember reading that article and, where I was and what I was doing, and just had to keep rereading it over, saying, is this, saying that the US government has actually been investigating UFOs and had a program seriously, and that there is an inclination that they're real and there is something to this, concrete nuts and bolts. And once I read that, I just became almost, fascinated by the idea of there being potentially something else, or that there might be, people who are in the know maybe to know about this, that are confirming that there is actually something to this mystery. So then I was researching on my own. And yeah, it was only until last year that I read Ross's book and he put me on, to maybe go into the National Archives. And then I went on there, and then discovered that my own grandfather had witnessed a UFO potentially through Bill Chalker, this scientist. So I called him up on his family landline and spoke with his wife.
How did he take that?
Well, at first, I think his wife was a little skeptical of who I was and what I was calling up. She was probably, a bit like, who's this fella? And I explained who I was, and eventually, Bill did take over the phone, and I think he was kind of a bit taken back by it, being like, oh, that name sounds very familiar. And then I explained that I'm the grandson, obviously, Tom, of this case that he documented in the Oz Files and some of his other books and articles. And then we just sort of got chatting. And I explained what I'd been doing, what I'd sort of found. And he was very forthright, very open. And actually, sort of helped me see if we could get in touch with Ken Llewellyn, because that is where he'd originally picked up Tom's case. This was the senior Air Force public relations officer down in Canberra at the time. And Ken Llewellyn had covered cases of sort of paranormal or strange experiences by people in the intelligence and military in Australia before. And Tom's case was a big one for, I guess, people within those areas, because he was considered quite an esteemed and credible witness, with multiple people witnessing this incident at Woomera as well. So I tried to reach out to Ken through some of the details I've been given, and it was just unsuccessful. I wasn't able to get onto him. And then eventually I kind of, while digging around, was able to discover that Clive Williams, who had authored my grandfather's biography, Tom had actually had handwritten his testimony of the UFO account at Woomera for him. So I secured the copy from Clive Williams in the book, and then basically went back to Bill and said, hey, I've actually got Tom's description in his own words of this account. And Bill was, obviously extremely, fulfilled in the sense that he'd been looking into this case multiple times over the years, and to actually have the account from Tom himself and confirming that, what had been, I guess, described in the testimony to Ken Llewellyn and through those areas was actually true. And that there was a report written, and it was somewhere in the Defense Department. God knows where. That's sort of what we've been working to try and uncover. But when we looked at Tom's account, we thought, wow, there was this reference to, in his account at the end, it must have been one of the 3% of unexplained cases. And that was, a very particular statement given the time, I think, that he was even open to the idea that knowing that there were unexplained cases in the Air Force. And he would have known, he would have been in the know. He had an extremely prestigious Air Force history before he moved over to Woomera to work with the Weapons Research Establishment. So Bill put me in touch with an archival researcher in England and journalist called Dr. David Clarke. Now, people might recognize that name if they've watched James Fox's latest documentary, The Program. Dr. David Clarke has sort of been, really at the heart of trying to get UFO documents and documents revolved around, secrecy in this topic from the British Ministry of Defence for a long time. And it even uncovered the Rendlesham UFO forest incident back in the early 2000s. So he'd done a lot of hard work, really digging through the files. And Bill put me in touch with him. And if you've watched The Program by James Fox, sorry to jump around, you'll see that he was involved with, partly helping uncover the Calvine UFO photo.
So you were in touch directly with this guy through Bill Chalker.
Yeah, Bill Chalker gave me his email. So I reached out to him by email, explained who I am. And then, unbelievably, David Clarke came back to me and told me that he'd actually interviewed my grandfather in 2002, just sort of 2 years before he'd passed away. And I was absolutely, blown away by sort of that discovery. And then, David Clarke went into a little bit more detail and explained that Tom had described his UFO encounter at Woomera. And David Clarke had been put in touch with my grandfather through Clive Williams. That's how he ended up getting in touch with him and interviewing him, because he'd heard that there was this case down in Woomera. And so David Clarke interviewed him about that. And then unbelievably as well, Tom came out and sort of explained that he'd originally been a part of a joint secret United States Air Force and Royal Air Force committee that investigated UFOs in the late 1940s. And for anyone that has covered, I guess, deeply into Britain and the United States, there's a lot more information about the United States UFO investigations through Project Sign, Project Grudge, Project Blue Book, so forth. But Britain is far more secretive. And David Clarke had done a lot of work on Britain's first UFO study, acclaimed, called the Flying Saucer Working Party, which was established in 1951. Now, this was created by Winston Churchill's chief scientific officer called Sir Henry Tizard. And he'd actually been involved in creating or played a role in the creation of Woomera as well in 1947. And Sir Henry Tizard in 1951 set up this extremely secretive study, and they called it the Flying Saucer Working Party because there were cases of Air Force pilots and some credible witnesses, having encounters. And so they took members from, the Admiralty, the Air Force and the military, and a very small group to do this sort of study. And you can read the study itself. It's not very transparent. It's very short. And they kind of say that there's not really enough here to suggest that UFOs are real until we get more data. But keep in mind the context. It was being run alongside the CIA at that point in time. So they'd incorporated the United States Air Force intelligence and the CIA into this study to help them to determine the outcome. And the history sort of indicates that the CIA and the United States Air Force wanted to hush this up. Maybe around sort of more sinister reasons, but in particular the Cold War. And sorry to go on a bit of a loop there, but
no, go on.
Tom, with this claim that he'd been on this joint United States Air Force committee and the Royal Air Force in the late 1940s, predates the Flying Saucer Working Party, which is Britain's first secretive and documented case that we have of UFOs. So whatever Tom was alluding to appears to be prior to the Flying Saucer Working Party, which is
with his 3% comment.
Which is 3% comment. And he explained in that interview to David that, they were able to determine that 3% of cases were unexplained. But that was just, I think, the cover story for, there's more to that percentage and more to those cases than what he's probably covered that would probably be allowed to be spoken of, I imagine, given what they knew. And when I looked at my grandfather's record that I'd gotten from the Royal Air Force, I realized that in the late 1940s, there was this particular allocation of where he'd been assigned to a special duties unit or in the Air Ministry. And it had, with the Special Air Ministry unit, another allocation called Miscellaneous 460. Now, David Clarke had sort of gone into the archives in Kew for me to see if we could find anything about this, if there was any trace back to it. We haven't been able to find anything as of yet. But I then went and did my own research and deep diving because this mention of this joint United States Air Force committee that my grandfather had been on, and went into kind of to look into some of the US records and see what I could find. And there wasn't much there. The first sort of mention of a big UFO incident being investigated between Britain and the United States appeared to be something called Operation Mainbrace, which happened in the ocean. There was meant to be a sort of big encounter between joint forces doing a training exercise. But in the J. Edward Rappelt, who'd worked for Project Blue Book, he was going over the old Project Sign records that were the first original United States Air Force investigations into UFOs. And I found this case that he'd covered, and it happened in November 1948. And it explained that in Germany, this UFO was seen, by a very credible Air Force witness, and that it was documented on radar as well. So they had 2 points of corroborating data to track this UFO. This is in November 1948, towards the end when this account occurs. The name of the actual witness is redacted in J. Edward Rappelt's report on flying saucers. But when I looked at my grandfather's record, I saw that he was released from this sort of special duty list, which I was able to track down through his biography and also some records that he was actually in something called the Western Union Defense Organization, which was the precursor to NATO. So he'd been secretly sent to France to help establish the precursor to NATO with Belgium, French, European allies to create the basis of this essentially union to stop any war breaking out again in encroaching and infringing on Western Europe. So my grandfather was brought in that to do the Air Force intelligence at the Western Union Defense Organization. But he leaves the Western Union Defense Organization at the end of November 1948, the exact time this first Project Sign UFO report comes in, where they've tracked a UFO for the first time on radar in Germany, the Allies.
So do you think him leaving that position was because of that report, or do you think that report came due to him leaving his position and he is maybe somehow responsible for that?
I'm not sure, but in his biography, he mentions specifically that he obviously helped create the framework with the Air Vice Chief Marshal and the group of special duty list units that were there to establish the Western Union Defense Organization. But he helps create the plans for the Western Union Defense Organization, but he specifically mentions that he doesn't even attend the presentation. He leaves. Very odd considering the work that he'd done. And this is kind of typical of Tom when you go through his history. He doesn't care. He's very quiet, unassuming. He just, does the work and, gets on with it. He's not looking for any sort of acclaim, which is what makes a lot of his UFO history so credible. He was not someone that was outspoken or trying to make a name for himself. But when you look at his record, you see that he joins this mysterious unit in the Air Ministry, given it looks like a very particular unit in itself, called Miscellaneous 460, at the same time that he's left the Western Union Defense Organization and this UFO on radars popped up. And the context is that he had access to a range of sensitive air intelligence because he was actually designing the plans for the protection of Western Europe from an Air Force point of view in case another Nazi Germany incident broke out. So he would have been getting these reports from the Americans, from different allies, and some of them probably would have been, UFO reports. So he was actually probably in the know or briefed to actually be able to investigate these. He had the clearance because he was looking at these plans.
So just to clarify that, to make sure I understand it correctly, so he's essentially in charge of NATO's defensive air strategy.
Yeah, so prior to NATO, the Western Union Defense Organization is what the Americans asked to set up before they joined. And yeah, he's under the Air Vice Chief of Staff and with this very small selective unit. And because he's a United States Air Force intelligence officer, a Royal Air Force intelligence officer and operations officer, he was given the responsibility, to come up with these air plans in case, this event like that happened. So very highly cleared. And
I mean, if anyone needs to know, it's that guy.
It's him, yeah.
So let's move into some of the real juicy stuff. Now, in your documentary, there's talk of a crash retrieval that has happened at Woomera. Is that correct? Or that is where it was taken?
Yeah.
Run me through that, from sort of who's involved, when it happened, and what was sort of discovered on this thing.
There was a case at the same time as when my grandfather had his UFO sighting at Woomera.
So this is the same year?
Same year, same rocket, the Black Knight rocket, right? So my grandfather was head of the Black Knight rocket tests. So he was the principal officer in charge of range operations. So his job was essentially the bloke who makes the call whether you push the red button or not and launch the rocket. And during that time, there had been obviously lots of claims and cases and sightings of UFOs throughout Woomera. But in this book by Timothy Good, who was a British UFO researcher, he'd developed a contact who worked at Woomera, who was an engineer. And it was in 1958 or 1959 from Timothy Good's account. But he explained that he was assigned to the Black Knight rocket. And during this time, he was stationed at the facility at Woomera, not the actual rocket launch site, where they would kind of work on the rocket parts and, basically do the engineering side of things. And there had been this sighting of a silver metallic ball, which was located outside the trial zone of the Black Knight rocket. But it had been involved with a helicopter that was searching for a missing girl, because Woomera had families stay at the home facilities there for people that were employed there. And this missing girl had gone, off the grid, and they were out looking for her, and they discovered this metallic dark silver ball.
So they were looking from like an aerial position from a chopper.
Yeah.
And whilst looking down at the ground, they spotted this silver ball.
This silver ball, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they obviously collected that and assumed it to be part of the Black Knight rocket. So they took it obviously to the engineering lab where, the engineers were to examine it, because they believed that big metallic ball, whatever it was, 2 feet, quite a large object, probably, I imagine, a little larger than a basketball maybe. And they were taking it to the Black Knight because they believed it was a part of the Black Knight rocket. And when they examined it, I think they realized pretty quickly from the account that this was something very peculiar. And when they examined it, and they did lots of tests on it, so they realized that when they actually lifted it up, it was abnormally light. So you could pick it up by one hand apparently. And this was a solid metallic, obviously.
It looked like from what I understand, just like a giant piece of metal.
Yeah,
right?
Perfectly round metallic ball, essentially.
And what I found really interesting was that they were not able to dent, scratch, break, nothing, but also holding an oxy torch to it, and it did not heat up. That is extremely interesting. They were able to put their hand on the ball right after they'd held an oxy torch to it, and it was not hot.
Yeah, the engineer had done that several times when he'd put the oxygen torch to it. And essentially, they were like, we need to look at this closer. So they, ran more tests on it, and they determined that after obviously a range of different tests that, this was nothing that could probably be from a foreign adversary or from a rocket. And it apparently sat there for a few days from the account. But then very shortly after, it was claimed by the Americans. So there was an American observer that had gone in and, with sort of range security staff, taken this object and brought it under the jurisdiction of the United States. Now, yeah, you have to probably understand as well that the United States were running their own tests at Woomera. So Woomera was like a kind of facility for hire for the contractors would come there from the United States, and the Americans tested Sidewinder missiles, the red rockets, which von Braun was sort of associated with. They tested those at Woomera, right?
And that's something that's kind of continued on, right? I mean, a lot of the top secret bases, Pine Gap, Exmouth military base, these are all kind of joint intelligence places now. They're not Australian Defence Force. They're a joint base.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and Tom was, deeply involved with the collaboration between the United States and their contractors, because they were trying to get Americans to come to the range and test their experimental aircraft and missiles. Like, that was a big part of actually making money for the facility. So America was, really involved at Woomera at that point in time, like early days, but they would eventually overtake Britain in terms of how much value Woomera had to them once Britain's nuclear program started to wind down. But yeah, kind of back to the case, the Americans claimed this metallic ball as part of their space program. They claimed it was some sort of satellite component or something along those lines. But
right.
They had this operation running at that time called Project Moondust, which was to collect, foreign tech, essentially, which might, fall under Russian origin. And they would think that would maybe be something that they could, maybe reverse engineer or claim as, something they might be able to learn something from. But this object was considered, I guess, a part of that program, potentially, the Moondust. And they shipped it, according to this this engineer who had spoken with someone higher up to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which would make sense given that was the home of probably foreign technologies and trying to uncover them. But the engineer had been told essentially later on that, pretend that event didn't happen. Don't acknowledge that event occurred. Right? They were really trying to hush it up, that the Americans had claimed this thing and then sent it over to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And for those that don't know, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base has been the home of UFO lore, and also documents claims for forever. Like it's got a rich history in the
That's
cover
an
up.
interesting place, that's for sure.
Yeah, so the fact that it tied obviously to Woomera and this object being discovered kind of played to the idea that maybe there was something in this. But the engineer himself really gave this interesting account where he said that for many years he believed that what he had at that point in time and that they examined wasn't like some part of an American or Russian project or satellite or rocket, that it wasn't even part of a UFO. He states in his own words that he believed that it was a UFO itself. And he states that very strongly. And if I went to try and look into the history, and I've been trying to track down this individual because he'd requested anonymity with Timothy Good, who'd given the account. And I found, in the book, he has got some of his documented history. He became, in the electronics industry. He became a police inspector, worked his way up, and then eventually was recruited by the Governor General for a security detail. So this person was, quite a credible witness, and really, I guess, relied on for being aware and switched on, given his history and how he sort of, I guess, continued on. But it becomes more curious because the Black Knight rocket was obviously being, the tests were being run by my grandfather, right? And he'd had a lot of collaboration with the Americans at that point in time. So he'd run operations with them during the war. During the Cold War, we've got, the Western Union Defense Organization. We've got the Joint United States Air Force Committee, which investigated UFOs with the Royal Air Force Intelligence. Then we've got, other connections as well from, maybe Sir Robert Cotton, who he stayed with, who became the United States attaché between Australia. And given that sphere of whatever it was made its way into the United States hands, it would not surprise me in the slightest, given that Tom had the clearance and the history of investigating UFOs, being briefed on them, being a part of the United States Air Force investigations, that he was probably involved with that handover to the United States, given that he was in charge of the Black Knight rocket. And the engineer said they had to disclaim it, that it wasn't the Black Knight rocket's piece first, before the Americans could take it. So the question then becomes, how deeply involved was Tom with this object going to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base? And I've tried to dig into his American history, because Tom, when he became principal scientific officer of Weapons Research Establishment, after he was, specifically in charge of the range, he spent a lot of time in the United States. And one of the cases in particular is White Sands Missile Range, where Oppenheimer conducted the Trinity test. And in his own biography, he mentions that he went to White Sands Missile Range along with many other restricted sensitive US installations. And he said that he'd basically worked with White Sands Missile Range to bring particular programs to Woomera. And that from then on, in his words, there was always a United States program operating at Woomera.
And the Trinity tests were not far from the Roswell crash. Is that correct?
Yeah, they were. Well, they were like, I think 2 years before.
Yes, but in terms of like distance, where these kind of things were happening.
No, yeah, very close. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, the test itself, yeah, I imagine it wouldn't be far at all, right? Like a Roswell would be east, like
yes,
probably a few hundred miles, I reckon, maybe.
And it's just
Sands.
interesting that we've got this sort of UFO activity happening so close to a nuclear test range in the United States, And we're seeing the same kind of things here in Australia around our nuclear test range.
Definitely a connection, it seems. As to what it is, it's very hard to determine. But there's so many cases, I think, that are just documented from both sides where UFOs appear to be interested, in our nuclear capabilities. And even if you go and read the old Project Sign reports, which are a fascinating read in itself, but you'll see that there's mentions of, you know, they believe that after Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Alamogordo, that's when maybe these UFOs started popping up. That it was this splitting of, the atom
Yes.
that drew their attention. And given that Australia and Britain, were obviously conducting the same tests, I don't think it's a coincidence that there's so many UFO accounts in and around the Woomera prohibited area, Maralinga, especially where the atomic tests were conducted, which was in the Woomera prohibited area, but very far west, obviously. And there's some amazing accounts there, and people that investigated them, were generally baffled. There was an amazing account by a home office photographer called Derek Murray, and this was, I believe, in 1957, if I'm getting my dates right. And essentially, they were there. There's a train station that would take people, to Woomera in the middle of nowhere, this desert location in Maralinga, especially where the atomic tests were, where they were conducting them. And after one of these atomic tests, this home office photographer called Derek Murray was waiting with the Australian and British forces there, playing cards before he would get on, this train and essentially, I think, get out of there and go back to England. And they were at this encampment there near the station, and someone ran up to them. An Air Force and military officer came up and said, "There's a UFO just over the site." And I think there was a group of apparently 16 or so individuals there that kind of laughed at this guy and said, "Oh, he's probably just mistaking something for, something prosaic and explainable." And they followed this guy to where he'd said this UFO was. And in Derek Murray's account, they say that there's this blue metallic looking disc hovering just, up above the ground at the Maralinga atomic test site, really, like just outside of it. And it's got a dome on top, and it's on a 45-degree angle, tilting, looking towards them, and it's just sitting there. And they apparently watched this UFO hovering there for 15 minutes as dusk approached. And the actual communications officer for the Royal Australian Air Force came out and witnessed this and was just shocked. And he ran back to the telecommunications tent and tried to contact HQ to say, is there anything here that's ours, or what is this? And tried to report it. And after sort of 15 minutes or so, this UFO just took off, apparently at, like light speed, shot into the sky right in front of all of them. And Derek Murray said, he was a practicing Christian at the time, and he swore by, his faith and his religion and all things, that this was a solid metallic craft that they all witnessed take off. And I've been trying to dig into this case in particular because it's a fascinating account. But it appears from his account that most of the soldiers there were operating under atomic secrecy protocols given the atomic tests. So there isn't too much other information around it.
What year was that? Sorry,
that was 1957, if I'm recalling correctly. Which is when they did conduct, obviously, the Maralinga atomic test there.
Mm-hmm. And that's 2 years before Tom Dalton sighting at Woomera. Yeah. And it's interesting because they've both got that circular craft with a dome description in both of those accounts. And it's only 8 or 9 years later that there was the Westall sighting in Melbourne. I think that was 1966. And I thought of that just because it's got a lot of the characteristics that you just mentioned there, these saucer-shaped craft with domes that are hovering on an angle, and then they just shoot off. There's all there, and Bob Lazar's even talked about that, I think, about this, at least in some of these models of craft, that there is this intent, the way that they hover, turn on their side or onto their belly, and then
belly
shoot
first.
away. Yes, belly first.
Yeah, different speeds according to him, based off, depending on, if they're hovering or just moving slowly or moving quickly.
Yep,
But again, very, very hard to know. I think the accounts are, or we have the testimony. It's always good when you can get obviously radar confirmation as well with something like that.
of
One of
course.
and Woomera itself has one of the most astounding UFO cases as well. And it was confirmed by radar as well. And this was 1954. So there was, a Canberra bomber, which was a giant military plane, right, that was being used for, an experimental test, flying in the Woomera prohibited area. So they had the radar tracking it, and then they had these actual security officers tracking it as well with the binoculars and observing this. And they witnessed this kind of silvery disc come flying in a different path from the bomber, cross its sort of path after, then come around and start to trail it. And then there's this metallic silver disc sitting over top of this bomber as it's moving along. And
Wow.
the disc was originally tracked at 60,000 feet. So, like enormous height for this disc to first appear. Anyway, he's looking, this scientist, this British scientist who's near this range security hut, is observing this UFO in his binoculars on top of the bomber while it's going. And meanwhile, there's two other witnesses as well, that one's like 300 yards away from him, the other one's right next to him. They're watching this thing, and he, in the report, like this is an official Woomera report, he says like that he basically had to rub his eyes because he could not believe what he was seeing. He was like, this is unbelievable. And he looks up, and the bomber's still there, and then the object's still sitting above it. And eventually the bomber then just takes off after them observing this for a few minutes. And the radar was able to track the object at Woomera, and this is confirmed in the report. The object was estimated to be going nearly 6,000 kilometers per hour on radar. And they were able even to get a hit on the object, and they determined that it was twice the size of the Canberra bomber from the radar hit.
Wow.
And yeah, it was like a metallic disc. It had a translucent sort of look to it. And I've posted some of those reports are in my video clips of them, but you can go and read these reports yourself, and they're credible, documented military reports of something that's seen by multiple witnesses, but then also tracked on radar. So something very real occurred there. And Woomera is full of these accounts. It's amazing.
It's unbelievable how much information that has some credibility to it, and some good level of evidence that is actually just sitting out there online for anybody to go and read. Like, there is an astounding amount of information, really, that I feel like a lot of the people who dismiss this thing at this stage, I don't even take offense to it, because I just understand that you just haven't looked into it. And that's fine. You're probably busy with other things in your life, but this is a path that I've gone down, you've gone down. And I think any sort of reasonable person, once you're presented with some of the evidence that is widely and freely accessible to anybody, it really becomes hard to deny that there's something going on in the skies, and has been for a long time.
Yeah, there's so many accounts now. Like, if you look at the history, it's very rich. A lot of credible witnesses, from defense backgrounds, but then you also have corroborating data points right now. Like when you have something on radar saying that there's a real hit and a real object there that's not, a plane, and it's or maybe alongside it, so what it is. And then you've also got what the witnesses are seeing. A lot of these people don't have anything to gain by talking about these accounts.
No,
it was career suicide for a lot of these
that's right.
individuals. And what they're doing is just giving you their honest assessment of what they're perceiving. And then a lot of the relief comes from them actually then finding out that, the radar is seeing it as well, or there is another corroborating witness or something along those lines. So it's not something that's, I think, an illusion. you wouldn't have these persistent cases continually throughout time. They would have disappeared and gone off the map if there was just a rumor. I think that the fact that they have just continued to pop up and continued actually to increase in the numbers that we're seeing. So, there's something very real happening here.
There is, and I think if we come back to like the modern day, I think there's a lot, especially with this drone situation, whatever that's been happening in New Jersey. I think there's a lot of speculation, and rightly so, that some of this is perhaps a government psy-op, that they're using this sort of alien or UFO narrative as another means of control, which they've done before. So it's a reasonable thing to have some skepticism about, but that for that to have been done, I think that's kind of utilizing technology we have now, or that we've probably had for the last 20 years, to be able to pull off such an elaborate psyop, to essentially trick the whole world into believing that there's something going on for their own benefit. But when we go back to the middle of the 50s, the end of the 40s, and there's the same reports, there's craft going Mach 2, there's, craft 60,000 feet in the sky traveling at these kind of speeds, that you can't argue with that. There's no psyop happening there. So I think whilst skepticism is healthy, and I have no doubt that the government at times probably have some nefarious intentions there, and that even might be the case. There might even be something going on. They might even be latching on to this real and genuine phenomena and trying to twist it into the way that to go the way that they want. But I think there is more to it than that. That might be the case, but there is also something that is unexplainable going on, that has been for a long time.
Yeah, and I think from the hearings and everything that's come about in the United States from 2017 onwards, the claims that there have been from individuals that have been in these programs, or have known access, or been trying to get access to these programs because they know about them, that are potentially involved with the recovery, the study, the tracking of UFOs or material. I think that's a real big indicator that there is something going on, because the congressional hearings are almost implying that the government and people that should be in charge or in the know of this topic, it's being kept from them. And for whatever reason that is probably why it's so serious. The claims have been, maybe it's national security. It almost seems like it could be, an arms race, that if there is, this sort of UFO showing these capabilities all the way back, and that's in the 50s, and then what they have now, the value on that technology would incite, an arms race if this was a physical craft with a technology that could be reverse engineered. It'd be the most valuable asset to the military and intelligence community, because whoever essentially has control of that power would then be able to, rule the world from a defensive standpoint of view. If you can put these things over, foreign adversaries in the blink of an eye, or, dissemble any, defense capabilities that they have as well, plus all the other capabilities that would potentially come along with it. It's the greatest weapon in a sense. So there's a lot more, obviously, behind closed doors that I don't think we're privy to, that's involved with this subject. And the fact that they've gone for so long, that there's been this cover up, in a sense, by the Defense Department to, stigmatize the topic, scrutinize people, spread misinformation. It really alludes to the idea that they're going out of their way. They're really going out of their way to muddy the waters here. So if there's nothing there, if there's nothing to this topic, then why are they putting so much time and resources into discrediting this? Wouldn't you let this topic just fizzle itself out? People would be found out if it was fake.
When a madman speaks rubbish, people generally don't take any notice, because they know it doesn't matter. But there is a big effort into silencing people and muddying the waters, like you said. It's interesting you made the comment, whoever has this technology would rule the world. Who, if you had to pick a country right now, who would you say is in charge of the world?
Well, I think, the United States would be the powerhouse probably of global affairs. There's clearly been a lot of claims that China are, inching closer or trying to make that imperial play to become the leading global superpower. But yeah, I would say probably the United States. I don't think Russia is the fierce foreign adversary that's kind of it's made out to be. I think given that they've been struggling in the Ukraine and having to employ North Korean troops and resources there to help them, fight a battle against that sort of region, I think they're a lot weaker than probably what they, puff their chests out to be, maybe.
Do you think if Russia were perhaps doing better or a bit further down the line with some of this technology than America, do you think America would allow that kind of narrative to get out though, or do you think they would double down on the fact that there's nothing to see here, there's nothing to worry about, we're on top?
It's a good question. It's kind of hard to know because obviously we've heard about kind of alleged documentation revolved around communication between Russia and the United States, and actually having an open channel where they would notify one another if there was a UFO in their restricted airspace, in the sense that they would stop potentially a false nuclear claim or threat. So a UFO wouldn't be mistaken as a foreign nuclear bomber or missile. So they've clearly, from some of the claims, had some communication potentially about this. And it wouldn't surprise me if the United States does have a reverse engineering program, as it's basically been made out to be from the hearings and from some of the whistleblowers. If Russia had the same thing, and we've heard that as well, whether the United States would admit that is, it's an entirely, different scenario. I think the amount of secrecy they've put on this topic, it's almost, if they try and go back now and say that, oh yeah, we admit that, those 75, 80 years of us lying to the public and suppressing this information, it's already a time of a lot of distrust in the United States. And I think that fuels probably, more rhetoric that the government can't be trusted. It's
It's interesting you say that, because I actually think that it's hard now to take. I mean, look, I like Lou Elizondo, and I think he is an honest person,
mhm.
but obviously he comes from a military background. He's got a military mindset. So I often wonder if maybe that is a slightly warped perception on things. But I find it interesting that they've turned around after 70, 80 years and said, okay, look, there are some things in the sky that we don't quite know what they are. But they haven't really acknowledged that they did lie about it for 70 or 80 years, and they haven't really come out and said why. And I actually think that kind of transparency and some, come out, put your hands in the air and be like, hey, yeah, we did this. At the time in 1947, it felt like the right thing to do. This is why we made that decision. But, the times come where it's actually kind of stonewalling society in a sense of kind of moving forward and progressing. And I feel like if there was that level of honesty and transparency, it actually would feel a bit more authentic, and people would resonate with that a little bit more. And it might actually, although they would be admitting to cover-ups and things like that, it could perhaps set like a new precedent of a new era of transparency. Like, I feel like it's going to be hard to get people on board with you when you still haven't admitted what you did wrong. Like, you kind of have, but you haven't really. And I think that little lack of acknowledgement could make a big difference.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I completely agree in a sense. I think probably the problem we have is that, the whistleblowers and maybe around people like Lou Elizondo and the kind of the group that seems to be associated with the disclosure movement, Christopher Mellon and so forth, there seems to be a lot of questions over the interests, right? As to what the true agenda is for disclosure. And if you try and take like a step back and look at the bigger picture, it seems that there were people involved with a group like ATIP, right? That were maybe trying to get access to information associated with the legacy UFO program, which would be separate from them. And that the disclosure coming from this group that was maybe revolved around ATIP may have, come from the idea that if they get this out in the public, then maybe they can then get their hands on what the legacy group was withholding from them, the information, the craft, the
There's
material.
levels to it, isn't there?
Yeah, and that's really where I think we have to, obviously be critical and just make sure when we're assessing the true nature of what disclosure means, regardless, obviously it's a good thing, but is disclosure only coming about because it's a simple, a free enterprise claim that one group that's involved with private aerospace contractors or military contracts wants access to what the legacy program or the original UFO program has so that they can financially benefit. So it's essentially a monetary gain as compared to the public being given the truth. And what if it is controlled by a group that essentially just closes off disclosure and then classifies it again for themselves and we're in the same picture? It's really hard to know with all the sort of games and shadows, but I do genuinely believe, and this is my own opinion, what people can think. I think Lou Elizondo was a legitimate whistleblower. I do, and I
Me
think
too.
I've read enough into that to think that he knows enough, um, and he's under heavy heat, and the fire's getting hot, like it's getting close to his feet because he is pushing, the disclosure narrative. And I know a lot of people think that he can't be trusted because he's counterintelligence, and he's worked for the intelligence community, and there's nefarious agendas at play. But I really do think that some of the group there that are working for this are trying to do the right thing, whether people see it that way or not.
So just before we move on to the next section, I wanted to ask you, what's your opinion, given we've got UFOs, tailing bombers, crashing around nuclear sites. What do you think, let's assume these are being operated by some form of other intelligence. Well, they're obviously intelligently operated, right? What do you think's going on there?
It's a great question. Bill would probably be keeping an eye on me, making sure I don't speculate too hard, and
Hey,
and
let's be clear.
yeah,
This is
and
just
but
conjecture.
yeah,
I'm just interested to hear. I mean, let's be clear. Like this, no one knows for sure, right? I
no,
don't know.
no,
You don't know. But we've both been deep in this topic for a while now. So based on what you've sort of come across, what is sort of beginning to, what feels right to you about what's going on?
I have to say that the more that I learn and read and discover about, you know, the phenomena and UFOs and everything that's going on, the more questions I have, and I get confused in the sense that I think I've got something figured out, and then I learn a bit more information. I go, well, that just kind of contradicts to what my own idea of it was. I think that probably the best way that I can try and look at it is that, you know, we are limited by the amount of information that we can understand as a human being. We have senses, smell, sight, hearing, taste, so forth. And we're only designed because of evolution, from what we understand, that we can only process what's relevant to our worldview so that we can live and eat and sleep and so forth, right? And that there are things that exist in the universe. So, for example, the amount of observable light that's in the spectrum for us to be able to see with the human eye is a very small sliver of what exists in the universe, from dark matter and different frequencies and waves, right? So that leaves the possibilities wide open in the sense that if you can only see a very small percentage of the actual observable universe, that means that there could be a whole range of different things operating in different spectrums, what we might call different dimensions, parallel realities, so forth. But I think when you look at how strange the phenomena is and UFOs and everything that's going on, it's possible that we can't rule out that there's probably a multitude of things going on. There could be visitors, non human intelligence from different planets. There could be beings from, say, a higher frequency or what we would call a different dimension. I don't understand that space and claim to. It's obviously very complicated science. But the idea that there might be things that exist in different levels of reality is potentially a possibility. And I think when we see things that UFOs do, whether that's potentially, and again, this is speculating, and I haven't seen it myself. But if, say, a UFO transforms from a ball of light to a physical craft, you know, is that playing with our understanding of reality and consciousness? Is that, like the idea of a double slit experiment? Is, when they shoot those protons through the gap, and then when it's not being observed, it turns up as a wave of light on the wall. But then when we shoot the particle and we observe it, it stays as a particle and hits the wall. Is that what's going on with UFOs? Like, have they transcended physical reality and now can move between a wave of light and a physical material bit of matter, like a particle, a being? Like, the possibilities are endless. It's
That's right. And I think trying to obviously trying to understand it through a human lens is all we can do, and that's what
yeah,
we do. But it's important to remember, I think, that we are looking at it through we're looking at something that is non-human through a human lens.
yeah,
So to try and assimilate a prosaic human explanation could probably be a bit of a silly idea at times, because that's just simply not exactly what we're dealing with.
and this is the thing is, I think if once you go into the deep, dive of, some of the interdimensional ideas and hypothesis, right? You start to realize that, this could possibly be something that's disguising itself as what it is. So it may be another higher intelligence disguising itself or controlling what we're seeing, just so that we're able actually to perceive it and understand it, because it may
Yes.
be outside our understanding of reality, that it needs to create a conduit or a medium, than which it can communicate with us so that we can see it and interact with it. But that may not be actually what it is. And
Hmm.
that, that's just unbelievable to imagine, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
that you were getting into the realms of religion and, philosophy, right?
Mm.
There's a really deep, profound questions that come with trying to understand, whatever this is. And what's really, I think, exciting, and I think, for people like us that are investigating and trying to dive deep into this, is we do appear to be on a bit of a shift with the way that people are looking at this topic and the way that we're, trying to engage with whatever it is. There is some kind of movement amongst people to actually try and understand what this is, and that's a really exciting thing. And I think we should be trying to do this. It is important. I think it's important.
I 100% agree. And I was honestly thinking the same thing. Like, just the fact that, me and you are sitting here talking about the legitimate possibility of a, multi-dimensional interaction, and that this is a concept that not only we can grasp, but that, we're considering seriously. And it's not just some tinfoil hat people talking absolute garbage. Like, this is kind of where we are at now in 2025. And you also mentioned that there's a big shift going on, and I really feel that as well. It feels as though, but it doesn't just feel like a shift in, say, like culture. It feels like there is a real shift in like people's awareness and like understanding and ability to even perceive the concept of a multi-dimensional interaction. Like, I feel like this conversation 15, 20 years ago, you'd just be laughed out the room.
Yeah. No, it definitely. We're starting to explore probably more metaphysical aspects of reality, right? and these kind of components which were considered maybe woo or outlandish or crackpot. Um, we're now starting to having like given what the UFO or the phenomena represents, the one thing that I think it really does for us by acknowledging its existence is it forces us to challenge our own understanding of the way that we perceive the world and what's possible. Because if you can then admit that a UFO can do these incredible things and can, you know, completely contradict your understanding of reality, then you start to think, well, like what else
What
is
else?
possible with reality then? Like
Yes,
if that's giving me an example of something that defies physics or gravity or even you know experience, like what you're seeing and what you're feeling, if that can change that, then what else are we capable of? And you start to get into the realm of maybe you know unlimited potential
absolutely.
within human nature.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that is the road that this is all going down. It it's interesting as well when we talk. We mentioned like our senses earlier, and that we sort of we only see a small part of the light spectrum. It might have been Jacques Vallée, but I can't remember where this quote is from. But they referred to our sensory system rather than like an ability that we have. It's more of actually like a limitation or a filter, and it's actually filtering out or limiting us from actually being able to perceive everything that there is. And that might be because it would just simply be too overwhelming, like there's just too much going on, that it would be just too much for the single human mind to be able to work with and take in 24/7.
I think so, right? Like most people are kind of content with, their day to day and what they have because it's manageable. And if maybe, and it's not, I'm not making this association in any sense because it's an accurate analogy, but, for maybe people that experiment with like, psychedelics or something along those lines, that may be very overwhelming because it's an experience maybe of information that you aren't able to take on board with everything that's already going on. It's kind of like it's a full on experience of information, right?
That's right. It expands your perception of reality into these things that you've just never had to kind of consider before. You've never had this sort of input, and it's challenging your brain to kind of compute that and deal with it. And for some people, I think it can be a bit much. Well, I mean, even for some people, just the idea of UFOs is a bit much. So even that's an example of just how, I guess, reality shattering some of this concept and idea can be for some people.
I think it can be scary, right? We want to go throughout our life knowing that we can be secure and stable and that we understand everything around us. And as humans, we love control. It's really like about controlling what we can, right? And the idea of like a UFO or a phenomenon or whatever it is, being able to like pop into your reality and play a trick on you and then pop out, or that it can appear, almost as if a phantom or an apparition and physically interact with you and then, shift to wherever it goes. That removes the idea of like, being in control of your environment, which is silly in itself because, it's a volatile world which we live in. But for people that, like I said, want to just have that sort of, control, regimented, routine, um, this represents a threat to how we feel about ourselves. And I think if it is quite daunting because it's like taking the idea of mythology, for example, or gods or angels and demons, whatever it is. It's like taking that idea and then putting it into physical reality. All of a sudden,
Mm,
something that became a fantasy or a story is all of a sudden tangible, uh,
that's
and that
right.
and that will freak people out. Like I get that,
Yeah.
I completely get that.
I think it's Carl Nell that said, it's one thing believing in something, but knowing that it's real and, having it stare you in the face, they're very completely different things.
Exactly. And imagine, for the people that have experienced these kinds of things, I think that's probably what's happening to a lot of people. Like the saying, seeing is believing is, it's come about for a reason. People that have been, grounded in reality and think that they understand everything that's in front of them, all of a sudden see something that doesn't make sense. It completely turns your worldview upside down. And all of a sudden, something that was, like you said, not real, it being real in front of you, it changes the way you see yourself and the world.
Yeah, it's almost it's like the gate. UFOs in a way are kind of like the gateway drug because, like you said, once once you understand that reality is not exactly how you have been taught, then the door is now wide open for what else? What else isn't what I've been taught? What else don't we know about? Not even necessarily that it's been covered up or a conspiracy, but I think just the idea of thinking we know everything and we've discovered everything is it's a silly approach. I think there's probably a lot that we don't know and we don't realize that is not even being covered up. It just hasn't been discovered.
Yeah, it's probably like limitless. Like
Yeah.
it's probably endless, right? The amount of information that we can barely even comprehend or understand. It probably just goes on forever as we learn a new truth, and we get to that point of maybe being able to understand that. Then the next layer or level is unlocked, and that's why the UFO topic is so engaging, right? For people that become really interested in it, you do start to go down and explore the idea of consciousness and reality, right? I think it's just a natural path when you're trying to uncover whatever this is. And there's this obviously belief that's been around that the UFO represents, maybe a tweak or a twist to our own consciousness. It's essentially something like a Rubik's cube, or it's asking us to solve it to push us to that next stage of
Yeah.
maybe conscious evolution, right?
Yeah.
If can you figure this out so that you can now take the next step to being having a better understanding of maybe the universe, right?
I love that. That's a really good point, man. And I feel like there's a lot to that. And I think that goes back to what we just said, the fact that we're even having this conversation is due to us looking into this stuff. And 20 years ago, we probably wouldn't have we might be thinking this stuff, but we'd never probably talk about it. But it's now pushing people and having this kind of ripple effect. Just even just the fact that you and I are talking about it, I think it has this subtle ripple effect on people who might listen to it, or they hear about someone who listened to it, and now all of a sudden these ideas are becoming more and more like in the zeitgeist and in the conversation, and it just has this very subtle effect of just opening people's minds around the world.
Yeah, it's great. It's really good. Yeah, like I really enjoy like engaging with other people about this topic, and it's funny because for so long I myself felt quite, I guess, isolated with the work or the research or what I would do, and I didn't really engage in a community sense or have other people to speak to about this. So many people throughout my mates and so forth that just didn't really have an interest or blink an eye towards this, and many people just it's even if they have a revelation about what it is, it doesn't change how they feel. But there are obviously people that when they see this for what it is, it brings people together, and it allows us to sort of have tough conversations, but also exciting conversations that there are possibilities that things could be better, or things aren't as mundane or as terrible as maybe they seem, right? In the world there are opportunities for this kind of topic to push us to be better if we take it on board in the right way.
Absolutely, yeah. I agree. I think it's a very, very exciting, and yeah, it's kind of the basis of how we can be better and where we can go next. When we spoke on the phone the first time, you mentioned a little something to me that you said you'd never actually spoken about publicly, but was kind of a big revelation that came through learning this about your grandfather, that actually has a more direct tie to the phenomenon in terms of your family. Do you want to talk about that? Because you didn't. I specifically said I don't want to know. I want you to save it for the podcast. So I've been looking forward to hearing about this.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, and I think I'm going to start to speak openly about this because I think it's important, to the conversation and also just to the story that I've sort of been uncovering. Right, my own experiences, and I'm happy to admit this, are pretty much zero. I myself have never actually, I think, seen a UFO or had sort of any encounter myself. Right, and given I've been so interested in it for probably for a fair while, I think people will probably be surprised that I haven't had an experience. And also given my grandfather's history, learning about that, that was a real revelation. It almost made me feel as if I'd maybe inherited some kind of interest in UFOs through maybe my grandfather's suppressed suppressed history around it. But obviously, the bombshell coming out about my grandfather, right, through the investigation that I've been doing, really had a big impact on my family. And as I said, my father, who was the son of Tom, he'd never really even entertained the idea that UFOs were a thing or real, and it was like maybe almost the idea it's possible, but probably not likely, not probable, right? And he obviously, kind of had to come to terms with the fact that his father had, not only openly admitted to believing probably that UFOs were real since he'd seen them, but that he'd investigated them and that he was interested in them by the sounds of things. And my mother, right, is a very quiet, intelligent, and, just reserved individual. She works at the Australian Nuclear Research Facility. She sort of runs the communications there. She's head of communications at ANSTO. That's Australia's only nuclear reactor, right? And she's always liked solitude, her own time, her own space, and she doesn't speak often as well. Ironically enough, very similar to my grandfather, even though they're not related. They're only by marriage, right? And after she found out about all this stuff with my grandfather, and this was only very recently, she sat my father and I down and she explained, in the most honest and I guess, confronting way possible, that she and herself had had multiple experiences and encounters with the phenomena. And, given my dad had obviously gone through the first revelation of his father and not knowing anything about his history, was just about then to hear that my mother, his own wife, who he'd been married to for God knows how many decades, was now saying that she'd seen and had interactions with UFOs and the phenomena. So
He's probably thinking, what is going on here?
Mate, he got upset. He will be okay with me saying that. He got upset.
As in, like, a bit sort of
I think a bit
angry?
annoyed, a bit angry. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think he was like, that can't have happened. That doesn't sound like. Are you sure? Blah blah blah. Like, a bit of denial about it, but irritated. And I said, look, Dad, like just calm down. Mum's speaking to us about this. Like, this is an experience. Let's just listen to what she has to say. Blah blah blah.
Sorry, are your parents still together?
They are. Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And so she's never mentioned this to him up until what, a few months ago?
A few months ago. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so as you can imagine, I was like, "Oh my god, what is
Yeah.
going on?" as well. But I was obviously far more excited than my own, father. I think he was probably having a paradigm, catastrophe in a
Yeah,
sense.
he's
And
like we were saying before, his whole worldview is just getting rattled up a little bit.
yeah, it's everyone around him. It's sort of been, I guess a part of his life, and he hasn't even known about it. Fair play to him. He's become far more open and accepting of it now, given what he'd learned, like through my mother and through his father as well. And I now can speak to my father very comfortably about the topic and have great, insightful conversations. And it's just a great thing.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
really great. I've really appreciated it. And yeah, obviously, so my own mother, she's actually American. So she grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, in a place called North Andover. And when she was very young, she described her first experience as being playing in the backwoods of an area. Probably, I imagine when she says like probably 7 or 8, so quite young.
So this
Yeah,
is in Boston.
in Boston, yeah, in the backwoods there. And her description it's sort of hazy because it seems like it's quite a confronting memory for her. But she describes something of the likes as a shadow or entity, a dark shadow, something entity, something along those lines, right? And she said when she encountered this up in close and in person, she didn't really know what she was seeing, and she's quite young as well, so it's hard to know. But she,
So sorry to interject here. So we're talking about like a humanoid looking figure or shape, but like shadowy and unclear.
correct.
And what year roughly would you put this at?
Yeah, God, this could be just around 60s, early
Okay.
60s, I reckon. Yeah, she described, like I said, whatever it is in front of her, and then she said, in her words, that this, whatever this was in front of her, stretched uh, as tall as it did wide. It like grew like a box, almost stretched up top and out wide, and went completely transparent in front of her. So basically, yeah, essentially was still there looking at it, but like a transparent kind of see through
Hmm.
it. And then she said she blacked out
So woke up in this field or in these
in the
woods?
woods. Yeah, woke up, yeah, and went back home. Um, so that's obviously her first experience, and clearly is it can be interpreted in different ways. I think people will obviously say that kids see things and so forth,
Mm.
and it could be an imaginary experience. But as I said, my mum is like she works in science. She's grounded in you know evidence and facts and reality, right? That's her sort of her basis. And she described this as a very real, very tangible, very confronting experience for her. And then later on, when she's like just into sort of early 20s, she's coming outside into a parking lot in Boston. And she described what she would call like a solid craft, but made of light, um, about 200 meters above the sky, right, in the parking lot out there. And, probably 500 meters away. And just moving strangely. Like her description was that it was just moving oddly, but very bright, like solid light, right? And
Moving strangely. What does she
yeah,
mean in terms of
her
like?
description was that she said that it just was moving through the air. Like she didn't say skipping, but she said it just moved oddly. Like it didn't move like it was moving like an aircraft. It sort of just, I need to obviously ask her again
It's in,
exactly.
the reason why I asked, and it's interesting you said skipping, is because that is what you sort of hear a lot. Is that these things when they, are tearing through time and space, that to us it actually kind of looks almost like, they're if they're going from point A to point B, it almost looks like they're kind of flashing in and out, and you only kind of see them there and there and there,
Yeah.
and you get that skipping, that ripple kind of effect. And you think that's kind of what she's
I
described?
I sort of asked her if that was sort of what she meant, and she sort of like I don't think she confirmed that, but
Yeah.
her description was that she could just tell it wasn't moving like a normal aircraft or whatever it was, and her descriptions were that it was sort of zigzagging around. That was sort of how she described it. Sort of popping around there, going up, down, around, across. Very odd, and this was she said described it like it was a good 2 minutes of watching this thing out in this parking lot where she was.
Did she feel like, or did she say that she felt like this thing was there, like for her, looking at her, or anything like that?
Well, get ready, right? This it's funny you actually mentioned that. So she said as she's watching this thing doing this, all of a sudden it stopped and it's almost like she said she felt like it was looking at her. She described it as like it had noticed her. The way that it sort of had like she couldn't really put an exact idea to what the shape of the object was because of the amount of light, that how bright it was that was coming off it. And she's also described, interestingly, that there seemed to be maybe other colors mixed into the white light, bright white light. But she said she got the feeling that it was like had basically tilted or looked towards her, like it had noticed her, or that it had
It
noticed,
like it had cottoned on to the fact that she could see it,
was
perhaps.
watching it. Yes, yes,
It's interesting.
that's how she.
It's almost like they're always, or they're always there, but they don't expect people to be able to see them, and perhaps it maybe realize that someone could.
Yeah, whatever it was.
Yeah.
And then she said it just shot off into the sky, like northwest, I think she said, just took off like at an incredible speed and just went out of sight over the out of the atmosphere, out of the horizon. And she just thought it was, unbelievable what she'd seen. And yeah, that was obviously her second encounter, which is, an incredible encounter in itself, being so close. And the whole idea of actually seeing whatever that was it's
Mm.
a remarkable sighting. But this is obviously where things escalate a little bit. Now, she moved to Australia and was living in Uluru. That's where she met my father. He used to be the
What
park.
what brought her to Australia? To
I think
Uluru
she was,
specifically?
yeah, I know, yeah. She was just traveling, I believe, originally. I probably just wanted to explore and get out and see Australia as, kind of a wild country. So yeah, she came down and ventured around and ended up, I think, working out at Uluru for a little bit. And that's where she met my father, who was a park ranger out there, working at the time. But prior to meeting him, interestingly, she said she had this very real and terrifying experience out at Yalara, which is sort of like an area just outside of Uluru. And she was staying at almost a portable home there. She said she'd been watching the stars at night and was just sort of like, she liked to stargaze, right? And she said she went back into her home to go back into her room to go to bed after being out there, and then jumped into bed. And then she said she heard like a low pitch humming sound, or like a strange vibrational auditory sound, and it seemed to be coming closer. And her description was that a bright light appeared to come close to her bedroom window, where the light sort of shone in the sense like a truck shining its light into the bedroom. So she, kind of was trying to examine this light, and then the light moved around to the other side of the portable home. And meanwhile, she's, trying to figure out if there's a car, truck, whatever it is, right, out the window. And then basically the light's on the other side, but she can still hear this loud sort of vibrational auditory sound. And the light then comes back around to the window, and she climbed back into her bed in that time and was obviously full of fear, she described. And then she said,
So she's seeing kind of her room and her inside her house illuminated, like the interior is illuminated by
through
this
the
light
window when
source.
she was in her bed at first, yeah, with this bright white light, very bright, like her description, right? And this sound that accompanied it, and got up to investigate, and had gone around the other side, and then, jumped back into her bed. And then the light came back around in. And then her description was that she felt as if she was paralyzed all of a sudden, that she could only move her eyes, and that she was there in bed, and she could only move her eyes around. And then all of a sudden, she said she felt the fear of, like, ultimate fear was her description, and the presence of some sort. She couldn't see anything, but she said she felt a presence. And then she said she blacked out, and she woke up in the morning, the next morning, like in bed, tucked in. And a description was, to me, was that she felt as if she'd been under heavy anesthetic, and she
Just
couldn't
really groggy.
she couldn't go to work. Yeah, she had to call in. Yeah.
Any sort of physical signs after that, or
Nothing that I could confirm with her. And, in all honesty, like I said, my mum's quite a private person. She gave me permission to discuss and talk about this, obviously. And yeah, it's something I think she hasn't been that willing to explore, from what I can kind of gather. I think she's quite, you know, scared of the experience and maybe understanding more as to what it is or what happened. Uh, but clearly, I've obviously done a lot of deep diving into the readings of experiences and so forth, and you know, we've looked a little bit into her past as well, from when she was young, and seeing if there's any kind of correlations with whatever this was. And I think there's a possibility that she could be definitely an experiencer up close.
Well, she's definitely experienced something. There's definitely something going on there.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
no interest, or has it been thrown around like hypnotic regressions, like anything like this?
I saw, and I've engaged with sort of like Bill about this, because he's done this work in the past and knows this very well. This is like a specialty of his, and she hasn't really been open to the idea. Um, from what I can gather, I've kind of put a few things in front of her, just like she can just take it as her own time, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not something she's really wanted to, I think, go further into at this point in time. But yeah, I obviously recommend it if she was wanting to look at it further. We could do the holotropic Groff method, but I've also not going to shy away from the fact that can also muddy the waters or make this made complicated, because it might be drawing something from the subconscious, so forth. It's not really clear as to what may be the full experience there, and if that's the truth, if she does do a regressive hypnosis, if that's actually really what happened, right? So, but the most fascinating component that really ties it all together is that she works as head of communications at Australia's only nuclear reactor, and you have my grandfather with all these like atomic connections as well with the work that he did, and then the phenomena ties in between. She's not even related to Tom, but yet she'd had all these experiences, and before she even met my father, who was the son of Tom. So as you can imagine, I was just sort of wondering, what the hell does that all mean? Like, what is going on there?
And what age was she roughly with this experience, with the light in the room?
30s, in her
In
30s.
in her 30s, and this was the last time that something like this has ever happened.
That she's spoken of. Yeah, that she's spoken of. Yeah.
And did she know your dad at the time?
I don't believe so. No.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I actually, yeah, I don't think so. I'd probably have to confirm that, but I don't think so.
And I guess, so that ultimate fear that you said that she felt, I guess, is something that she obviously still kind of carries with her. Then, if she's, she seems sounds quite hesitant to delve into things any further. So that's obviously had like a lasting impact on her.
I think so. Yeah. Like I said, I do a lot of reading, and have just sort of recommended, if she wants to, read into a little bit more, and offered her a book to have a look at,
Yeah.
which could kind of ease her in, and not from the perspective of maybe, the phenomena being looked at with a negative connotation, rather a more sort of open-minded and objective look at experiences. And she kind of had a little look of a few pages and read through them, and just sort of was like, no,
Yeah. Yeah.
no,
Interesting.
no, thank you.
That was my next question, is that at any point in her life, has she herself, at least from what she's told you, has she done any of her own digging, like into maybe just, not even from a sense of, say, like abduction or anything like that, but just her own research into trying to think, what happened to me that day or that night when I was 21 or when I was a child, like for any of these experiences?
Not that she's really stated no. Like, I think, I think Boston had an interesting kind of history there as well. Like Massachusetts, sort of that area, right? Because that's where the Betty and Barney Hill case was. Um,
Interesting.
and John Mack obviously was quite a controversial, but amazing individual, working there at Harvard in Boston, right? And looking into the abduction phenomena and experiences. So she would have known, definitely, and she like might not have looked into it, but she would have known that was around. Absolutely. But
Mm.
I think all in all, like speaking to her about it, as I said, this is someone that is not, she's not looking for public attention, and she's not looking to, you know, go out and try and make anything of this. She's just told me straight up, as she is, that this was a real physical, tangible experience, and it happened to her. As to what it was, she doesn't know, but she knows that, she was fully aware and conscious of what had actually gone on from what she can remember and perceive.
I'm curious, when did your mum, I guess, not just get into her job at this nuclear facility, but like, become engaged in the science and the field that led her to that job? What's the timeline on that?
Yeah, well, it was later on, so it was probably, I think, like just after 2014, if I can recall.
Okay.
So
So well
more
after these experiences happened.
well after, yeah, more recent, like in the last 10 years, right? So that she's been working
Interesting.
in, yeah, definitely, yeah. So later on, absolutely later on, and
Was it a big career change? Like, what was she doing prior to that?
well, she'd worked in journalism, like she's like a science writer, I would say, right?
Okay.
So she's always been involved with, yeah, so probably philanthropic affairs, and like she'd worked with children's cancer research, right? And also Reconciliation Australia too, and done a lot of journalistic and writing work, right? So that's kind of how she ended up in the communication side of things for Ansto.
Mm.
But yeah, it's not anything directly related to nuclear, or say, until later on.
That's interesting. And the only reason, those questions come to mind is not that this is necessarily, again, we don't have the answers, but Michael Masters' extra tempestrial model, talking about things that have perhaps traversing not just through dimensions, but through time as well.
Mm.
Um, it's interesting that, it was after that encounter, where, whether you want to call it an abduction or whatever, whether lights came into her room, that she then went on to have such a, I guess, different and interesting career change, and especially relating to atomic energy. I mean, I don't know exactly what her work involves, but it just makes me wonder that, perhaps there's a reason to it, maybe something that hasn't even come to light yet.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Who knows, really, right?
Yeah.
It
Mm.
is, but it is intriguing. Like, it's again another kind of coincidence, right? I think it is. Maybe there is something in that she does
Mm.
work at, the Australia's only nuclear reactor. And I've obviously engaged with Bill, who'd actually done investigations into those areas there and tried to capture footage of, potentially UFOs or phenomena over the sort of Ansto, Lucas Heights area there, because there is a military base, Holsworthy military base, right next to or very close to it's a baby reactor, right? The atomic reactor there.
Hmm.
But he'd actually, yeah, obviously heard of cases and experiences and, incidents out there, and tried to investigate using spectrum analyzer camera footage. So, that area in itself definitely has some history, from what I can gather. There's not many places in Australia that have actually a nuclear reactor, let alone one.
You sort of touched on it earlier, just quickly. And when we had a chat the first time as well, you sort of mentioned there's a bit of a connection to the Strangeness in regards to the northern suburbs of Adelaide.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, so Salisbury.
Yes.
From a bit of reading and sort of some diving in, there seems to be a lot of stories in and around the Salisbury area, right? From people that obviously have seen UFOs, people that have actually claimed that there maybe is some connection between, sensitive facilities that were utilized at Salisbury with maybe this topic, right?
Do you
Um,
think that's perhaps more, maybe because not far north of Salisbury is Edinburgh RAF base? Do you think that's part of the equation here?
well, they're definitely connected.
Mm.
Edinburgh and Salisbury, they kind of go hand in hand, in
Yeah,
my
they're
opinion, I
pretty
think.
much right next to each other, really.
Yeah. Well, because Salisbury was originally used as sort of the setup and facility that would send everything to Woomera, right? So
Right.
Salisbury was
Makes
the base.
sense.
Salisbury was, yeah, I guess like base of operations for Woomera from a kind of, I guess, administrative or logistical standpoint of view. So there's been claims like of things that have occurred at Salisbury, as to any corroborating evidence around it. That's probably a bit far fetched, but there does seem to be a bit of a theme where Salisbury has popped up multiple times. And why I kind of mention that is, so my grandfather, who was obviously working at Woomera for that period of time, his main office when he wasn't at Woomera was at Salisbury, right? That's where the Weapons Research Establishment base was for Missile Projects Group, which he was principal scientific officer. So a lot of the communications that came back and forth between Woomera went, to Salisbury. That was sort of where he was running operations out of when he wasn't working on site at the Woomera facility.
Well, just down the road, just kind of on the fringes of Salisbury here, we've actually got an office for Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. So, who knows? Who knows what's going on with those guys?
Well, yeah, if you want to go down that rabbit hole, the organization that pulled my grandfather's records, originally the file on the National Archives, right? It was the Defense Science and Technology Group. And for people that haven't explored what the Defense Science and Technology Group do, they're essentially Australia's DARPA, right? And
Interesting.
if you actually go on their webpage and you look through their key partners, you'll notice that there's a very, there's a consistent theme of some very prominent names within that have been accused of aerospace contractors being involved in the sort of reverse engineering program. So British Aerospace, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, they're all
Yep.
there as the main partners for the Defense Science and Technology Group, which is
very interesting.
Yeah, like I said, I'm not insinuating that there's maybe something going on there, but it's a funny coincidence.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think most people would say there's no such thing as coincidence.
Right? Yeah, when the coincidences start piling up, you start to have to wonder: is there actually something in this? Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's this field in itself. Like, all we can kind of try and do is look for consistencies and key data points and see what ties to one another, and at what point can it actually be utilized to say, oh, this actually means they're connected, right?
Yeah. Something else I wanted to ask you about, and this is sort of a little bit unrelated, but it kind of ties into the, high strangeness in South Australia.
Yeah.
Do you know much about the Maori man?
I don't actually. No,
Do you know what it is?
I don't think I do.
No, that's all right. So it's it's about 2 hours away from Woomera, northeast, so sort of like more towards like the Queensland border.
Okay.
And it's a massive geoglyph of that's been sort of imprinted in the ground of like a kind of looks like a man holding like a boomerang or a spear or some kind of like handheld weapon.
Okay.
But this is like a full length, head to toe, full body thing, and you would only be able to see it if you're viewing it from a plane or a helicopter. Like it's just that big that you're not going to be able to understand what you're in if you're standing in it.
Yeah.
There's no known, there's no known creation date exactly. It was first discovered by someone flying over the area in 1998, and it's just one of those mysteries that you wonder. I guess it kind of falls into the crop circles area, but this thing, as you would know, Woomera itself is in the middle of nowhere. This is a little bit deeper into nowhere. Like I think that the closest town is Maree, which is why it's called the Maree Man. But even this is a little bit outside of Maree, and it's massive. If it was made on the ground, to create such a an accurate representation of a humanoid figure, you would have to have like some sort of GPS technology or something like that, right? But remember, this was first seen in 1998. So yeah, I was just curious if you had heard about it or if you had any thoughts about that. But even if you haven't, it's it's just another little breadcrumb into the
Yeah, that's
Australian strangeness.
well, I don't think we can rule out trying to utilize First Nations history to trying to maybe decipher a little bit how this UFO history is tracked throughout the centuries. Aboriginal culture is one of the oldest
Yeah.
ancient traditions in the world, and their vocal traditions of passing down stories are generally very accurate and have continued through the lineage, as far as we can kind of find, right? And interestingly enough, we have to be careful to try and make associations between, I think, UFO lore and culture and the indigenous connections between them, right? But there's absolutely some really intriguing accounts and, like you said, glyphs. When you look at like the one Gina, right? That's probably the first one that comes
Yes.
to mind. I think the spirit and rain clouds. The rain cloud spirits or gods. One of the really interesting descriptions I read of them, because that's actually what this book is here about the one Gina. They described the translation as they exist in the space between space, and they exert their influence over the land and the people, even if we don't know it. And
Wow.
I just thought that was really like a powerful kind of interpretation of a description of what they are. Like, it really was just like, it's open ended,
Dude,
obviously. But
it's so interesting, and it's funny because here we are half an hour ago talking about how awesome it is that we're having these discussions about multi-dimensional entities, but in reality, we have this kind of like ignorance and dismissal of these native cultures and these First Nations people and their stories. But I mean, like you just said, they've essentially been talking about multi-dimensional entities being here and having an
thousands
effect
of
for
years.
thousands of years. It's just us arrogant white man that is only just beginning to get our minds cracked open.
Materialistic, reductionist sort of perspective. And that's the thing is, these cultures that have been connected to land, right? The power of, I think, spirituality, when you have an association, when it's tied to your environment, right? The connection really becomes quite pure, in the sense, like, you could almost say it's a connection to source, for example,
Mm,
right? That we don't really have in the concrete jungles that we live
no,
in and on our phones and in technology. Like, there's a reason when we get out into nature and we separate ourselves from our 9 to 5, that we start to feel this
better.
feeling of freedom and inner peace and
Yeah.
connection to the land, right? And that's something that was kind of, I think, the basis of their culture and identity. And unfortunately, and it's been terrible that what we have separated them through the history that we have, but obviously ourselves as well. And it may very well be that these cultures that have had this understanding of what we call spirituality, or whatever their interpretation of the unknown is, it's one in the same thing for them.
Mm,
That
yes.
it exists at the same time for them. And maybe, as some interesting kind of statements Lou Elizondo made in Imminent, if you read that book, he talked about the idea that many people that had basically been a part of Gary Nolan's studies to do with the Cadet Patamen and the brain scans and experiences, most seemed, with those experiences, seemed to have some sort of native lineage. Um,
Interesting.
and that really stuck out to me, because I
Mm,
thought,
I didn't know that.
yeah, you mentioned it. If you read Imminent, there's a very interesting section on that.
Yeah,
It makes a point.
I
I think
I listened to that I haven't read it. I've listened to the audiobook, but perhaps I was not quite paying attention at that part because that's a very interesting fact.
he talks about Cherokee, yeah, and
Mm,
that may play into the idea that maybe because First Nations or native cultures that are connected to the land, they may have a stronger connection to whatever this might be, the phenomena, and they're able to perceive it because they're more in tune with the greater existence of
The
whatever this is.
source.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. And that could be a possibility.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, it seems like there are all these ancient cultures all around the world through history, who, you know, have these accounts or these stories about a greater power. You know, it's obviously slightly interpreted slightly differently based on sort of who's telling the story, but they're all kind of telling the same story. And the white man just kind of came and invaded and ripped them not just off their land but apart from each other. It makes me wonder, like, you know, what really triggered the white skinned man to do that, and like what was the mental difference, like the motivation, rather than to be so concerned with being like connected to your land and your family. The white man wanted to like go out, like conquer, overtake, conquer. And it's almost like, yeah, that they were either missing the same kind of connection that we're talking about that these native cultures had with source, or whatever it is. Or perhaps, you know, if we want to stick with like an ethereal explanation, perhaps they were connected to like a different source, like something else that was pushing, you know, like a different entity. Like we talked about how, you know, these things seem like they could be like a Rubik's cube. They sort of usher humans into a certain direction to grow and develop. Well, perhaps the white man was sort of ushered to do something else, like in a different direction. It seems like with this great shift that we spoke about earlier, where there seems to be this dramatic change in perspective on how we're kind of viewing ourselves, each other, the world, the UFO phenomenon, that this shift is seems like it's beginning to align us back to the roots of these First Nations people, and that people are starting to really understand that we can't just throw nuclear weapons at each other. We can't just fucking destroy the world. Like, we are just humans are not not just the sole inhabitant of the world, but we're just a small piece of this massive puzzle, and we don't have the right to be behaving the way that we do, in a way.
It's true. I couldn't agree more. It seems that we've gotten so far away from whatever the honest truth is of who we are. And
Mm,
it seems to stem from obviously probably capitalist, mercantilist, you know, the drive for money and
yeah,
resources. Like we just want more, more, more. And
yeah,
that goes back basically thousands of years from empires clashing and cultures that are probably more traditional and subsistence based on the land have been content and understand the balance of biodiversity and the connection with keeping things in check. Where we, for whatever reason, the civilizations that have wanted to divide and conquer have been driven to try and take over and just get more and become richer and more powerful. And it really is this sort of this empty cycle that goes nowhere. And all it does is just leave a wake of destruction, right? And ironically enough, this whole kind of, I guess, path we've been on, the trajectory of Western society and culture, is leading us to a point where the environment could be at essentially a catastrophic point where we may be witnessing potentially, a climactic disaster impending or on the horizon if we don't change our relationship and the way that we perceive ourselves and our relationship to the land, right? And the
mm,
environment. How funny would it be if our arrogance of thinking that with all our technology and all our like pursuits of resources and understanding, we have to drop that and it's wrong, and we actually have to go back to maybe thinking and perceiving the world like a traditional,
yeah.
First Nations native
That's what
perspective.
they say in the Hopi prophecy. That's
Yeah,
exactly what they say, is that, you know, when this big change happens, that there will be no sort of financial system, you know, like what one person makes, everybody can share. and that, the world will sort of be not dictated, that's not the right word, but sort of living under the way that the First Nations people lived, in a much more sort of harmonious tribe-like society, but with this, I guess, element of technology, which is the way it was always meant to be, but we just kind of went up this road of materialism and just desperation to sort of chase money and have the best things, which has in turn kind of ruined us and taken us away from that source and that connection to the earth.
It's really important, I think, to study and understand history in that sense, to really give you perspective that, man, maybe just because of the way that we live or the way that we have our lives, it might not necessarily be for the best. It's just it's always hard to know when you're a part of something or it's all you've ever known, right? It's really important to explore the other side or the other picture from where someone else has come from, what they've been through, what's happened to them, and then you know judge them based off their experience, not your interpretation of their experience. Try to see it for what's happened to them, and yeah, we really need that right now. I think it's
Yeah,
the world's in a bit of a
it's
state.
it's interesting times, and I feel like that kind of leads into my last question, and this one might put you on the spot a little bit. So
All right.
take some time, and again, this is for the audience, and I know this as well. It's all just conjecture and trying to make our best guesses, but you would know that people like Lou Elizondo and others have sort of alluded to something that's going to be coming. The 2027 seems to be thrown around a lot, but at the very least, it sounds like 2030 is, by then it's done. So, what do you think this thing that a lot of people are alluding to? What do you think it could be?
Oh, yeah, it's a big question, isn't it?
It is a big one, yeah.
It's funny how many times it has come up. I think listening to Danny Sheehan talk about the idea that we should be sort of prepared if there is an intervention from maybe a higher intelligence and how we're going to cope with that,
Hmm.
if that's a possibility. Lou Elizondo, the idea of the book imminent, him speaking at the end of that podcast he did with Jesse Michelle's,
Yes.
really left like I think
Time is not a luxury.
yeah, and the way that he took his breath when he spoke about that as well, like there was just so much going on there in the emotions
Mm,
of him and what he wanted to say. It really made me kind of step back and go, "Wow, there's something, there's a bombshell there." He doesn't, he's, I don't, there's something real going on within him there that's making him feel like that.
it's interesting you say that, because for the video that I'm working on now, it'll actually be out by the time this is out, about the Galactic Federation, and I'm using a clip from that video, and I thought the same thing, but I knew about that clip and I knew it was quite impactful, and that's why I went for it. But as I was rewatching it, just before that, Jesse he says something like, it seems like you know a lot more than you can. Not that you can tell, but that you want to tell. And the camera just cuts to Lou for a second, and he doesn't say anything,
He's just like,
but like, yes, he's nodding, but also like the look in his eyes. It's kind of like, it's not just like yes, it's kind of just like, it's whatever that knowledge is. You could
it's
like
serious.
see in his eyes in that moment how heavy it is and serious it is, and then he goes on to say how time is not a luxury.
There was a lot there. I think
Mm,
if you're going to look and try and feel what's coming through the camera at that point and digest it really seemed like, you know, he was, yeah, chomping at the bits to, I just wish I could tell you
yeah.
guys it's really important that we get this out there. Like you could feel that coming through. I was blown away by that moment. I thought, far out, like what the hell is it that he knows? It just, and then you've got more and more players as well. Like there's the whole
John
yeah,
Ramirez.
Ramirez, yeah, CIA agent talking about that, and he's made some questionable claims in the past as well about wrestling with a reptilian or whatever that story is.
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, you can never know, right?
Yeah.
I can't doubt it because anything's possible. Like I said, once we get into the realm of UFOs and the phenomena, but obviously, yeah, you need to make sure that you try and provide more to the story if you can. But The one that really stood out, I think, for me, and I will answer your question. I'm sorry, this is my
That's all right.
long-winded way of like trying to justify what I say.
Yeah, it's a tough question.
That you had Robert Bigelow as well from
Mhm.
NIDS talk about the remote viewing project that he took on board and got all the remote viewers essentially to look into the future together. So, sort of a collaborative remote viewing project. And they all couldn't see past a certain date around this similar time frame. There was like a black block out.
Interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah, so
And
that
what
was
was that date?
he doesn't specify, but
Right.
it's in the vicinity, right? It's in it's in the near future. That was sort of what he was kind of getting to.
Mhm.
So you put all those together and you go, right, is this one big psychological operation to make us believe that there's some kind of impending event, incoming? Really hard to know. But I think if I was going to just openly speculate and have fun with it, maybe there is a predetermined date or event when contact is essentially set,
Mhm.
and that this whole shift we're seeing with the topic becoming more open, more people engaging with it. Maybe it's not by accident, maybe it's by design, and there's always been the allegations that there have been, you know, like I said, controversial and very hard to verify. That there's been agreements in place between maybe the US government back in the 50s and a non-human intelligence or phenomena.
Mhm.
And that sounds so outlandish and ridiculous. But at the same time, like I said, it's just we have to sort of be open to all possibilities, but go in with a skeptical mind and try and figure out what the facts are based off what evidence or what data we can gather. But that may allude to the idea that maybe there is. Who knows? I have no idea. I don't know. It's always falls into the category as well of like the doomsday prophecies, like
Yes.
Y2K, Mayan
Mhm.
calendar. So you start to feel like a kook.
Yeah.
Which those kind of claims have been made by UFO groups, UFO people in the past. This is nothing new when you look at the literature and the history. So who knows?
It's interesting. So you would say your answer is an alien sort of intervention or contact that is known about, because if that is what you're saying, that is kind of what I've began to believe, because prior to that I was really, as dark as it sounds, I was getting the idea that it was some kind of catastrophe, some kind of cataclysm that seemed like, people talk about like a magnetic pole shift, things like that. But based on Carl Nell's statements that I mentioned in my last video that will be out by the time this is out, it seems like he almost says it without saying it by the way he terms disclosure and versus catastrophic disclosure. He's saying that we need to get the public prepared and of the understanding of the existence of a non-human intelligence, because otherwise we're going to be in a situation where that information is forced upon them without them having any sort of prior priming to this concept. And that, again, going back to what we were talking about before, their reality is just going to be shattered if they aren't sort of slowly, gently introduced to this idea that, we're not alone and we never have been. So his statements there about controlled versus catastrophic disclosure, to me, kind of say that, yeah, we are potentially looking at some kind of intervention that is known to be happening that we sort of have no governance over.
Well, if there is, God, we're in for a shock. I think
Yeah.
that'd be a rude awakening. Like, can you imagine? Some like something out of Independence Day or District 9. A
Mm,
bloody ship turning up in the sky, and
yeah.
everyone who's ever doubted or ever thought anyone who ever talked about it was nuts, and all of a sudden you're looking at the reality of it. It's shocking to imagine, but
Yeah. I think a lot of people, I feel like no matter how hard they go with this controlled disclosure stuff, there's still going to be a massive, if this happens, there's still going to be a massive amount of people who are just probably going to have some form of a meltdown, I think.
I think they need to take that into consideration. I think that, absolutely there would be an increase in mental health issues. I
Yeah,
think,
if there wasn't enough already.
yeah, I don't think we could rule that out. There'd be a lot of anxiety around the unknown, and especially since it seems that the reason maybe a lot of this has been kept secret is because they don't have any answers to maybe what
Yeah.
this phenomena is, right? That we rely on the government and the institutions and the defense organizations in place to sort of provide us stable, environments for security, and give us answers to things, right? And imagine they're having to sort of tell the public that we've got something, essentially operating in our environment around us, and there's nothing we can do about it, and we don't know who it is, and we don't know where it comes from. I just realized I sound a lot like the New Jersey FBI.
No, but I mean that it makes a lot of sense when you listen to some of the comments that Lou has made. Like, that it's going to force us to sort of have a bit of reconciliation and reconsider who we are, where we came from, what our place is in our position, and given the way that we act when we talk about the constant state of war that the world's been in, and nuclear weapons that have these sort of ripple effects of destruction around the world. I think we a bit of reconciliation and reconsidering what we are and what we're doing is probably sounds like a good thing to me.
I think so. Yeah, but the fact that we even have nuclear weapons still is just insane. That there's the
Mm,
idea of mutually assured destruction as an option for the human
mm,
species. Because, yeah, like the idea that if you launch a certain number of nuclear weapons, that it kills the planet regardless, right? Because of the radioactive cloud that converges, or the film that basically takes up in the atmosphere, and then light can't get in. Like we all perish. Like, why is that even a possibility?
yeah,
Why
it's
is that even
ridiculous.
on the cards? Like, it's just so stupid in my eyes. Like, the whole idea and purpose of is potentially to, you know persist, right? Like, biologically, we're designed to replicate and have children and pass on, right? But yet, the atomic bomb almost is the antithesis to that, right? It's the complete opposite of life. It's death
Yes,
and ultimate destruction for and the existence of our species. So the fact that we even
The
have it,
Oppenheimer quote rings true, doesn't it?
so good, yeah. God, great. It's really important, like to understand the effect that had on him as well, right?
Mm,
To understand a man that made such an incredible sort of breakthrough in a sense, with obviously the help of a lot of others prior and around him. But it's it really shows the importance of, like, addressing nuclear disarmament and proliferation. Right, we really should be moving away towards that. It's so primitive, and that's probably why, if there is it's probably why the phenomena, if it isn't interacting with us, it's probably to do with that, because it's probably looking at us thinking, this species has had, probably a great leap forward or step in science with splitting the atom, which is maybe a key to, progressing in, who knows, faster than light travel, whatever it is.
mm,
And we meanwhile turn around and turn it into a weapon.
mm,
And they're thinking, this is primitive. This
yeah.
species is
They're thinking
destructive.
you idiots.
Yeah,
Like, look at what you could have done with this, and look at what you have done. And weapons are the biggest industry, really. Like, it's where all of our top science is put towards. It's where all the money goes into, and it's all based in this sort of paranoia of what if they have the same, it's all just about, like, just in case, or what if. And this just kind of
definitely.
creates this perpetual cycle of needing more weapons just in case they have more weapons. Like, it's like, I think we really do need some kind of intervention or some kind of mediation from some bigger, greater, more powerful source to put this to rest and really sort of reshuffle the way we do things, because this trajectory has been going like this for a long time.
It's true. Yeah, we definitely need to make a change. I think, if we don't, it's definitely going to lead to our own downfall. There's too many. there's too many people in power that represent unstable warmongering interests, right? Like, it's so weird that we kind of live in this world where we're worrying about the big bad wolf, whether it's like the foreign adversary, foreign country, these kind of like the new axis of evil, whatever it is. It's so strange that we, like, still live in that world when we have all this kind of progression that we consider around us, but we're still worried about blowing each other up because we don't trust the other country, or they want to take over the world. Like, who wants to be the ruler? It's obscene. It's
It is.
absolutely obscene.
It is. It sounds like to me, the leaders of the world need to do a bit of self-reflection, bit of self-growth, and I feel like it's really just comes down to learning to just respect another human as a human. I mean, even the thought now of like what war is like, it was only what 80 years ago, roughly World War II. The concept of one man who is in charge of a country. I'm obviously stripping this down to its bare bones, but you've got one man in charge of a country who's under some kind of disagreement with another man or small group who runs another country. And the justified response to that is to allow millions of people to die to essentially solve your problem. I mean, that's just obviously stripping it right down and taking a lot of complications out of it. But that is what war is, and that's what we're allowing to happen. And it's really just comes down to like a lack of, I don't know, like just being
Human
human,
nature.
and just understanding. Like, it's like we've just completely gone off the rocker and just lost what it means to just like respect each other.
It's true. Yeah, I really hope we can somehow sort our alignment out. But like I said, that's why there has to be optimism around this topic, because there is an
I
opportunity
agree.
to acknowledge that we could be better. And I think Grush made mention of it before, where he said that that what we're looking at with UFOs may not be as may not be more advanced that we are, in a sense, like biologically or evolutionary wise. It may be just they took a different path with their technological route. We decided to make atomic weapons out of the nuclear science that we discovered, where they took a different route and chose exploration of the galaxies or the stars or the dimensions, whatever it is potentially, that they did. And what I really find fascinating when I dive like deep into, say, the cases of experiences and abductions, right, is there seems to be this theme across people that have interactions with the phenomena, is that they seem to convey the message that they are, you know, concerned about us, that they're worried that they can even make contact with us because they have evolved to not even possess the traits or qualities, maybe, of even having, aggression or war or conflict within their whatever their group is or whatever they are. That they maybe, have a completely different makeup, um, as as the phenomena. They don't possess those traits that we do, where we have to compete and kill and fight. So they're just weary of us, maybe.
Yeah. And, if an intervention is on the cusp of happening, let's hope that is the case. And let's hope that we can actually learn something from them and, not approach the situation with hostility.
I completely agree. God, imagine how terrible that would be if we had first contact and our first decision was to launch a nuke.
Yeah. Let's hope not. All right, mate. I reckon that's a pretty good spot to wrap things up. Thank you for coming on today. I want to just quickly shout out as well. Do you want to let people know what your YouTube channel is so they can watch this documentary for yourself? And you've also got a interview on there with Bill Chalker. So you actually sat down with him. So that's another thing people can go and check out on your channel.
Definitely. Yeah, mate. Yeah, of course. So yeah, if people are interested in hearing, I guess, the story, in kind of a different format, with my grandfather and what's been unfolding, you can go to the UFOsy. Obviously, just want to explore the topic in detail, very similar to sort of what Josh is doing as well. I think we're kind of aligned on a really similar vibe. check it out, the UFO Aussie, and just see what comes of it. I think Josh can probably share the link or whatever it is if need be in the description. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll have all your
Appreciate
links.
it.
Yeah, thank you, man. I appreciate you coming on. I'll have all your links and stuff in the show notes, so in the description below. And yeah, I feel like we could probably do another 2 hours. To be honest, we could go down some more rabbit holes. So maybe we'll save that for another time.
We've got plenty. Yeah, we've got plenty to discuss. It's kind of never ending. But no, mate, I really appreciate you having me on. I'm honored to be a first guest. It's good to actually, just talk to another like-minded individual in Australia and just keep pressing the narrative and the conversation along. Let's just keep getting this out into the public, mate. I think it's good for everyone.
Love it. All right. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks, mate. Cheers.